At 5:47 in the evening, Silas Merrick was stacking crates of Cabernet against the stone gate of Hawthorne Vale when the black convoy came up the gravel drive. 3 SUVs, tires crunching in perfect procession, doors opening before the engines had fully stopped. Maxwell Chandler stepped out first, tossed a set of BMW keys through the air without looking, and said, "Park it around back, boss." The keys landed in Silas's open palm, calloused, steady, closing around them without flinching. He did not move to obey. He looked at Maxwell, then past him, to the woman stepping out of the second car. Camille Ardell met his eyes for exactly 1 second. Something in the ledger of the evening did not balance, and she could not yet say what. Silas did not pick up the keys again once he'd caught them. He set them down instead, on the low stone wall beside the crates, unhurried, the way a man sets down something that was never his to carry in the first place. Delia Thorne crossed the courtyard before Maxwell had finished straightening his jacket collar, lifted the keys herself without breaking stride, and pressed them into the hand of a junior staffer waiting near the trunk of the second car. "He isn't valet," she said, quiet enough that only Maxwell heard it, her voice flat and final as a closing door. Maxwell laughed, a short exhale through his nose, amused rather than corrected, and turned toward the house without waiting to see whether anyone agreed with him. Camille was shown into the estate's walnut-paneled conference room 20 minutes later, still faintly jet-lagged from the flight up from San Francisco, a leather folder already waiting square at her seat. Maxwell had prepared it himself, a cash flow projection for something called Argent Coast Resorts, glossy paper, color-coded tabs, the kind of confidence that comes from a man who has never once had a number of his questioned in a room he controlled. She opened it out of habit more than interest, tracing the columns with one finger down the page, and stopped on a depreciation line that refused to agree with the capital figure sitting 2 rows above it. She read it twice. The second read didn't fix it. The numbers simply did not want to speak to each other, and something in her, the part of her that had once helped balance a small manufacturing ledger by hand at a kitchen table years before any of this, refused to let the discrepancy go unmarked. A tray of coffee arrived without a knock, carried by hands she hadn't yet learned to attach to a name. Silas set it at the edge of the table, not in front of anyone in particular, the way a man sets something down when he has no interest in being thanked for it. His eyes crossed the open page for less than a second on his way back toward the door. "That column doesn't reconcile with the 22 filing, ma'am," he said, and was already 3 steps gone, before she could turn her head fully toward him. Maxwell filled the silence that followed with a joke about caretakers who thought themselves accountants, and the room laughed on cue, easy and practiced. Camille did not laugh. She marked the line with the edge of her little finger, pressing a small crescent into the paper, and did not lift her hand from it again until the meeting had ended and the room had emptied around her. Friday morning came in gray and cool, fog sitting low and unbothered over the vine rows like something that had decided to stay a while. A pickup truck rattled up the service road just past 7, tailgate loose and rattling with it, and a girl climbed down from the passenger's side, clutching a white bakery box against her chest with both arms, careful the way children are careful with things they have been told are fragile and nothing else. Camille was crossing toward the kitchen wing for coffee she badly needed when she saw Silas crouch on the gravel in front of his daughter, unhurried, tying the loose lace of one small sneaker with the same steadiness he'd used the night before to set down a set of keys that weren't his. He said something too low to carry across the yard. The girl laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that seemed to belong to a completely different morning than the one Camille had woken into. Camille stood at the corner of the building longer than she had meant to, and told herself, not very convincingly, that it was the coffee she was waiting for. Nobody introduced them, not that morning and not for several mornings after. Nobody used a title, not once, not even in passing. He was the man who had corrected a column and tied a shoelace in the same 18 hours, and she was the woman who had arrived in the second car, and neither of them had asked the other's name because at Hawthorne Vale, in those first days, no one had thought to offer it, and something about the not knowing had already begun to feel less like an oversight than a kind of quiet, deliberate room they were both standing in, somewhere underneath the fog and the espresso, and the folder, with the depreciation line that refused to close. A question had opened that would not shut itself again. How does a groundskeeper read a public filing the way a man reads something he built? Rain came out of nowhere on Friday afternoon, the kind that turns a pale blue sky the color of wet slate in under 10 minutes. No warning in the wind beforehand. Camille had walked out past the western rows to watch the harvest crews working the last light before the weekend. Notebook forgotten in her jacket pocket, and she was caught a quarter-mile from the main house when the first real sheet of it came down sideways. The caretaker's cottage sat closer than anything else in sight. She ran for it without quite deciding to, ducked under the low eave dripping onto the flagstone, and found the door unlocked, because nothing at Hawthorne Vale seemed to lock itself against anyone who belonged there, and she did not yet know, standing dripping on his threshold, whether she did. Inside it was small and clean, and smelled faintly of coffee, gone slightly bitter on a warm plate left too long on the burner. A wooden table scarred with years of use, 2 mismatched chairs, a child's drawing pinned crooked to the icebox door, a dog that did not exist rendered in confident purple crayon, and on a low shelf by the window, catching what was left of the gray afternoon light, a photograph in a tarnished silver frame, a younger Silas in a dark suit, standing beside a man Camille recognized after a long beat as a sitting California senator, at what looked like the ribbon cutting for an education trust, both men mid-laugh at something outside the frame. Beside the photograph, spine cracked soft from being read more than once, a hardcover titled Meritage, of Founder's Letters. The author's name sat under the title in plain, unglamorous serif type, Silas Merrick. Camille did not touch the book. She stood there with rain running off her sleeves onto the floorboards, and let the single word sit in her chest, Meritage, the same word that had appeared twice already in Maxwell's acquisition file, folded quietly into a line about portfolio synergy she had read straight past without stopping the first time. She had not connected it yet, not fully, not in a way she could have said out loud to anyone in that room, but some part of her had already begun doing the arithmetic in a place slower and more careful than conscious thought, the way the body sometimes knows a fact before the mind has agreed to admit it. The door opened behind her without a knock, because it was, after all, his door to open. Silas came in shaking rain from his hair, saw her standing at his shelf with her back half turned, and did not look surprised, only unhurried, the way he seemed to be unhurried about everything that might have alarmed another man. He did not explain the photograph. He did not explain the book sitting 3 inches from her hand. He crossed to a drawer instead, took out a folded towel gone soft with washing, and held it toward her without ceremony. "It'll clear in 20 minutes, he said, of the rain, and of nothing else, and the sentence closed the subject as neatly as a door. Delia arrived not long after, to walk her back to the main house under a borrowed umbrella, and said nothing at all on the way, though she walked half a step slower than she had walked that morning, as if giving Camille the room to look back once over her shoulder, which she did, and found the cottage window already dark. At the board dinner that night, under the low copper light of the tasting room, glasses catching the candlelight along the long table, Maxwell made a show of handing Silas his empty bread plate, as though the man were staff hired specifically for the evening's entertainment. "Clear this, would you?" A few of the directors chuckled without quite meaning to. Silas took the plate without a flicker crossing his face. He carried it to the kitchen pass and came back for the next one without being asked twice, and something about the total, practiced evenness of it, no jaw tightening, no eyes lowered in the way of a man being humbled, nothing at all except calm competence, made Camille's hand close around the stem of her wineglass until her knuckles had gone pale under the tablecloth's edge. She did not sleep well that night. In her room, laptop open on the coverlet, the house gone quiet around her, she typed his name into the search bar, with the vineyard's slow rural signal working against her, Silas Merrick, Meritage, and watched the page load itself in stubborn fragments, a headline half materializing letter by letter, a photograph refusing to fully render no matter how many times the wheels spun. She closed the laptop before it finished loading, not because she didn't want to know, because some part of her understood, lying there in the dark of a room that wasn't hers, that she was not ready to receive it secondhand from a screen alone without the man himself standing anywhere near the sentence. She had watched him carry a stranger's dirty plate without a single flicker of resentment crossing his face, and something about that quiet had already told her more than any search result was going to. Saturday broke clear and gold. The fog burned entirely off by 9. The whole valley suddenly visible in a way it hadn't been all week. Camille found Delia refilling the coffee urn in the kitchen and asked, as lightly as she could manage to make it sound, about the groundskeeper, how long he'd been with the estate, where he'd come from before that. Delia answered the question that hadn't quite been asked instead of the one that had. "He's been with this place longer than the vines you're standing next to," she said, setting the urn's lid back down with a soft click, and offered nothing further, in the particular way a woman offers nothing further when she has already decided the telling isn't hers to give. Poppy found Camille near the porch not long afterward, and took her hand without asking permission for it, the way children do when they've already decided you're safe, and led her out to the Merlot rows where Silas was working the pruning shears in long, unhurried strokes, the sound of the blades opening and closing steady as a heartbeat down the row. He handed Camille a second pair without a word of instruction, only pointed once at a cluster heavy with fruit, and stepped back to let her find it herself. She cut wrong the first time, too close to the cane, and winced at the sound of it. He didn't correct her, he simply let her look at what she'd done, understand it on her own, and try again. The second cut came cleaner. He gave the smallest possible nod, the kind of approval that cost a careful man nothing to withhold, and apparently everything to give. Poppy chased a monarch butterfly down the row, with both arms flung wide, laughing at nothing in particular the way children laugh at the sheer fact of running, and Silas watched her go without breaking the rhythm of his hands, his eyes following his daughter the exact way. A man's eyes follow the one thing in a day he has no intention of ever missing. Camille found herself smiling and did not immediately understand why, until she realized, with something close to surprise, that it wasn't the child who had done it. It was the specific, unhurried way the father was looking at her. At noon, Maxwell presented the Argent Coast plan to the assembled board in the Walnut Room. $480 million projected across 3 confident slides, his voice pitched for reassurance rather than for clarity, the way a man speaks when he's counting on no one checking his math too closely. Camille asked, once plainly, where the capital structure actually originated. Maxwell smiled and advanced to the next slide as though the question had been purely decorative, a courtesy extended, and then politely declined. Silas came in partway through to refill the water pitchers along the sideboard, and caught one phrase on his way back out synergy with Meritage's Bay Area portfolio, and gave no sign at all, not so much as a pause in his stride, that the words had landed anywhere inside him. In the late afternoon, Maxwell pulled her onto the stone balcony off the tasting room, out of earshot of the others. His voice dropped low, but sharpened hard at the edges. "You're the CEO. Sign, Camille. The board wants this closed by Wednesday." It was not a request, and she understood, standing in the slanted gold light with the vine rows spreading gold beneath them, that it had never once been offered to her as a request. Not from the first slide. He was not asking her to lead, he was informing her patiently of the exact shape her ladyship was permitted to take, and the shape had edges she had not agreed to. Sunday brought a stillness she hadn't slept enough to earn. Up before 6, restless from the balcony conversation replaying itself over and over against the inside of her skull, Camille went out onto the main house porch and found a cup of coffee already waiting on the railing, still faintly warm through the ceramic, set square and centered as though measured with a level. No note, no name. She looked across the wet lawn toward the caretaker's cottage. The lights there were already out. Whoever had left it had already gone back to whatever work filled his mornings before anyone else was awake to see it done. The morning board session went exactly the way Maxwell had clearly planned for it to go. He announced the final terms of Argent Coast, as though the matter were a formality remaining only to be signed, rather than a decision remaining to be genuinely made. Camille asked, again, for an independent audit before anything went to signature. Maxwell's tone shifted into something paternal, something that was likely meant to land as gentle, and instead landed like a hand pressed flat against the back of her neck. "You're new to this seat, Camille. Trust the process." 3 directors nodded along with him in near unison, a small chorus of agreement she hadn't asked for, and she felt, for the first time since taking the chair, genuinely and completely outnumbered in a room she was technically supposed to be running. Silas passed the glass wall of the conference room sometime after 11, saw the set of her shoulders through the pane, the particular rigidity of a spine holding itself together in public, and did not stop walking. In the afternoon he sat with Poppy at the edge of a low stack of oak barrels, teaching her to read the stenciled labels burned into the wood, patient with the alphabet the way he seemed patient with everything, and Camille watched from a distance she told herself was accidental, and knew, even as she told herself that wasn't. She saw him take up a wax pencil and write 2 words carefully on the side of a weathered old barrel already doing quiet service as an outdoor table. Elise, 2011. She did not ask what it meant. He did not offer to explain it, and something in the not asking felt, for the first time, like a kind of respect rather than a withholding. Delia crossed the lawn sometime before dusk, laid one hand briefly on Camille's shoulder without breaking her stride toward the kitchen, and kept walking, the gesture landing and lifting again in under 2 seconds. Wordless, deliberate, almost ceremonial, like something being quietly notarized between 2 women who understood each other without needing the paperwork spelled out. That evening, Camille called her personal attorney in San Francisco from the privacy of the guest room and asked him to trace Vestwood's ownership structure 3 full tiers up from what the public filings showed. She asked the question clearly, without hedging. She did not stay on the line long enough afterward to hear anything resembling an answer. Monday morning she found Silas in the barrel room, checking seals along a row of new French oak with the flat of his palm, unhurried as ever, and asked him something that wasn't about the company at all. Why prune this hard when the vines are healthy? He didn't look up from his work right away, let the question sit a moment before answering it. Fewer canes, denser fruit, he said finally. A healthy vine isn't the one carrying the most, it's the one that knows what doesn't belong to it anymore. One sentence, delivered flat and unhurried, and she heard it twice, on 2 entirely different levels, and said nothing back because there was nothing she trusted herself to say that wouldn't ask a question she wasn't ready for the answer to. Poppy ran in a few minutes later, breathless from crossing the lawn at a full sprint, and invited Camille to breakfast at the cottage the next morning with the flat, total confidence of a child who has never once in her life had an invitation declined. Silas didn't stop her, didn't soften it, didn't apologize for his daughter's boldness. "Poppy makes better pancakes than I do," he said, which was as close as he came all week to something like a joke, and it landed, unexpectedly, somewhere warm. At noon, Maxwell took a call out in the hallway that left him visibly recalculating something behind his eyes when he came back in. By 1 o'clock, the board vote had been moved up to 4 o'clock on Tuesday, 2 full days earlier than the original schedule, with no explanation offered beyond vague scheduling conflicts that satisfied no one who bothered to ask. Camille understood the real explanation without needing anyone to hand it to her. He knew she was digging, and he intended to close the ground over her before she reached whatever sat at the bottom of it. She walked the Cabernet Rose alone that afternoon, phone pressed to her ear, and called Ben Ortega, Vestwood's young CFO, and asked him to send her the original 2022 filing to her personal email account, not the corporate one everyone could see. There was a pause on the line long enough that she could hear him weighing the request against his own comfort. Then he said quietly that he would send it, and a few minutes later, he did. At the cottage gate that evening, Delia handed Silas a small craft envelope and gave one short nod. Nothing more said between them, the whole exchange lasting perhaps 4 seconds. He opened it standing in the doorway, read it once by the porch light, and looked out across the darkening lawn toward the single-lit window in the main house, where Camille was still awake, still working, and the blue glow of her screen visible even from that distance. On her laptop, the 2022 filing had finally, fully loaded. One line near the bottom of the ownership schedule sat by itself, plain as a fact of weather, impossible to argue with. Beneficial owner of Class A shares, Meritage Holdings LLC, 61.4%. She closed the laptop slowly, not because she didn't want to keep reading, because, sitting there in the quiet, she understood that she already had. Tuesday morning she did not come down for breakfast at all. Delia had told her the night before, in passing, almost offhand, to come to the estate library alone, before 9, and to come without telling anyone else she was coming. On the long reading table sat a single navy folder, unlabeled, closed, waiting the way a verdict waits. Camille sat down across from it before she opened it, the way a person sits down before receiving news they already half suspect, but haven't yet let themselves fully believe. Inside were 3 documents, each one heavier than the last. The first was an independent audit showing an $8.7 million transfer logged as advisory fees, routed through a Delaware entity called Argent Coast Advisors LLC, Maxwell Chandler's own signature notarized at the bottom of the page, an EIN number that traced the shell company directly and unambiguously back to him. The second was a trust deed from 2019, establishing Meritage Holdings under the sole founding authority of one Silas Merrick, majority owner of Vestwood Hospitality Group since 2022, in numbers too specific to be anything but real. The third was a will, Elise Hawthorne Merrick, 2020, leaving Hawthorne Vale in full to her husband Silas and their daughter Poppy, with a clause forbidding its sale or public disclosure for as long as either of them chose to live on it. Delia stepped into the doorway just then, said one sentence, and left before Camille could answer it or even fully look up. "He asked me not to tell you. He never asked me to lie for a thief." The door closed softly behind her, the click of the latch the only punctuation the room offered. Camille sat with the folder open in front of her for a long time, longer than she would have guessed she needed. She did not cry. She went back through the 6 days the way a person goes back through a room searching for something they'd dropped without noticing the coffee left waiting on the railing, the corrected column on a Thursday night, the row of Merlot and the small approving nod, the look on his face when a set of keys had landed in his open hand and he had simply, calmly set them back down. She understood, finally and completely, why he hadn't picked them up. At 10 o'clock, she found Ben Ortega in the estate office and handed him the audit without preamble. She said 3 sentences to him, short and exact. He went pale reading the first page, then nodded slowly and reached for his phone before she'd even finished speaking the third sentence. At 11:30, she walked out onto the main house porch, where Silas was coiling an irrigation line in loose, practiced loops, unhurried as always, as though the morning hadn't changed a single thing about his day. She stopped 3 steps away from him, no folder in her hands, nothing held up as proof of anything. "You've been here 6 days, she said. "You never once asked for a thank you." "I still want to say it." He straightened slowly, the coiled line looped over one shoulder, and looked at her without confirming or denying a single word of what she'd just laid out between them. "Bote's at 4, he said. "You won't be walking in alone." It was the closest thing to a direct answer she was going to get from him, and standing there in the mid-morning light, she realized it was already, somehow, everything she had needed him to say. By 12:30 word had reached Maxwell that Camille had asked her attorney to have an FBI liaison in San Francisco standing by, ready to move. He came apart quietly at first, then not quietly at all, storming across the lawn toward the caretaker's cottage and kicking the door open hard enough to crack the frame along its hinge. Silas wasn't inside. Only Poppy was there, cutting paper snowflakes at the kitchen table with careful, crooked scissors, Delia seated beside her keeping half an eye on the shears. Delia rose without hurrying and planted herself squarely in the doorway between Maxwell and the child. "You'll leave now," she said, in a voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation of any kind. Maxwell retreated, jaw working, but not before his eyes caught the hardcover sitting open-faced on the table. Meritage, a founder's letters, and something in his expression finished collapsing right there in the doorway, the last piece of denial giving way at once. By 2 o'clock he had gathered 3 allied directors in a side room, drafting in a hurry a motion to remove Camille Ardell as chief executive on grounds of overreach, built entirely on the back of an IPO-era non-disclosure clause he intended to twist far past anything it had ever been written to mean. At 3:45 Camille walked into the estate's largest conference room and took the chair at the head of the table, spine straight, hands folded. Maxwell was already seated across from her, smiling in a way that suggested he believed the entire afternoon still belonged to him. At 3:58 the door opened. Silas Merrick walked in wearing the same faded flannel he'd worn all week. Jeans, work boots still marked pale with dust from the irrigation line, hands rough and unhidden. No suit, no introduction offered or asked for. He crossed the room without hurrying, and sat down in the one chair that had remained conspicuously empty at every single meeting held in that house. For 3 straight years, the seat reserved, by a bylaw, no one in the room except Delia and Ben Ortega had ever seen formally invoked, for the beneficial owner of Class A shares. 6 directors turned toward Maxwell as one, waiting for an explanation. Maxwell looked at Silas instead, and the color went out of his face by slow degrees, the way light leaves a room when a cloud finally crosses fully over the sun. Silas set the navy folder on the table without a word, squared it once with 2 fingers. Delia came in behind him and placed the 2019 trust deed beside it, squared that corner too, and stepped back into the doorway to wait. Only then did Silas speak, his voice pitched no louder than it had been all week, issuing coffee or correcting a ledger line under his breath. "I'm not here to give a speech," he said. "I'm here to make sure this vote happens according to the bylaws of a company I still hold 61.4% of." The room went utterly silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it. Camille did not look away from him, not for a second. She understood, in that instant, with total clarity, exactly what he had done across 6 days, and exactly what he hadn't. He had not swooped in to save her from any of it. He had given her 6 days of restraint and silence and space enough to walk to this exact conclusion entirely on her own 2 legs, and had only stepped through the door once she finally had. At 4:07 Maxwell tried, one last time, to recover ground that had already slipped away from him. "This man is the caretaker. He has no standing to." Silas cut him off, without raising his voice a single degree. "Class A share ledger, page 17. Check it yourself, Max." Ben Ortega stood at that, cleared his throat, and confirmed the ownership structure aloud for the record in a voice that shook only slightly, then sat back down. Camille called the vote herself, chairing the room with a steadiness that surprised even her. The motion was simple and precisely worded: the removal of Maxwell Chandler from his positions as Chief Operating Officer and Board Chair, on grounds of wire fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, with the audit attached in full for any director who cared to read it before raising a hand. The vote came back 8-1. Maxwell was the only director in the room who voted against his own removal. At 4:22, the FBI liaison stepped into the room, unhurried, professional, unremarkable in a gray suit. Maxwell was walked out through the side corridor, no restraints, an agent stationed at each shoulder. At the threshold, he turned back once toward Silas, something almost pleading crossing his face before he could stop it. "You've known me 3 years," he said. Silas gave the smallest possible nod, no satisfaction in it, only weight. "I have. I let you walk far enough to get there yourself." By 5 o'clock the board had confirmed Camille as both chair and chief executive, the vote unanimous this time, 9-0. 2 of Maxwell's 3 allies resigned before the week was out. The third followed within days, unable to withstand the questions that kept coming. Silas rose from the Class A seat without another word, and left through the side door, the same way he had come in, as though the whole afternoon had cost him nothing at all to give. Camille stepped out into the hallway afterward, and did not follow him, though every instinct in her wanted to. She stood instead at the tall window, and watched him cross the lawn toward the cottage in the low, late light, watched him lower himself onto the front steps, watched Poppy come running full speed to wrap both arms around his legs the moment he sat. He bent down and pressed his forehead briefly into his daughter's hair, one long still second held between them, before either of them said anything at all to break it. Delia found her at the window a moment later, and pressed a small key into her open palm without any ceremony whatsoever. "Elise left this for whoever the next person turned out to be," she said, "who could walk into that garden with him and want nothing at all from it." Camille closed her hand around the key and did not go looking, that day or the next, for whatever it opened. By Wednesday morning the story was already moving fast, through the financial press. An SEC inquiry formally opened into Maxwell Chandler, Vestwood's share price steadying within 48 hours, instead of collapsing the way half the analysts had confidently predicted it would. Camille did not leave Hawthorne Vale, though nothing in her official calendar required her to stay. She stayed on in the guest cottage 2 extra nights, telling herself it was for the transition, though the transition itself had mostly finished by Wednesday noon, and both of them knew it. She found Delia in the main kitchen that afternoon, drying glasses by the window, and this time Delia was the one who offered the story before it was ever asked for. She'd been with the Hawthorne family since 1997, she said, long enough to have watched 3 generations pass through that kitchen. Silas had met Elise in 2008 at a wine trade fair up in Napa, already the founder of Meritage by then, though he'd said nothing about it to her for months. Elise found out 3 months in, from a magazine profile she hadn't even been looking for, laughed about it for 3 straight days without stopping, and married him anyway before the year was out. Elise died in 2020. Before she went, she asked him for exactly 2 things that he never let Poppy grow up thinking of herself as the princess of an empire, and that he never again feel he had to prove who he was to someone he loved. He had kept both promises without exception in the years since, which was the whole and complete reason he had let a set of car keys sit untouched on a stone wall 6 days earlier, without so much as a flicker crossing his face. Silas came to find her on the guest cottage porch that evening, hands in his pockets, unhurried in his walk up the path the way he was unhurried in everything. He didn't apologize for the silence he'd kept. There was nothing in his own accounting of things that required an apology from him. "You didn't need me to explain it," he said. "You already read The Vineyard." Camille held out the small key Delia had given her, offering it back across the space between them. He didn't take it. "That one isn't meant to be returned," he said. They stood a step and a half apart on the porch boards as the last low light of late September slid between them. Gold going to amber, going to gray. And neither one closed the distance, and neither one, in that moment, needed to. 3 weeks passed quietly, the way weeks pass when nothing dramatic is left to report. Early October settled fully over Sonoma the way it always did, the light going lower and more gold by the day, the last of the leaves starting to turn rust and copper along the fence lines that bordered the eastern rows. It was Poppy's 9th birthday. Camille arrived not as chief executive of anything, carrying a bakery box she had baked herself back in the city the night before. The corners visibly burnt, distinctly amateur, nothing like the catering she was used to ordering. Poppy kissed her cheek without a moment's hesitation and pulled her by the hand toward the yard, and Silas laughed at the sight of the 2 of them, an easy, unguarded sound Camille had not once heard from him across 6 days of ledgers and board votes and careful silences, and it landed on her harder than anything in that Navy folder ever had. Delia set the long table out on the cottage porch as the afternoon light went low and copper across the vines. Silas and Camille walked the Merlot rows together after supper, past canes he'd taught her to cut a month earlier, the fruit long since brought in and pressed, the vines already settling toward their winter sleep. He stopped at the last row and pointed to the old barrel resting beneath the end post, the same one marked Elise, 2011, that she had first seen from a careful distance weeks before. Underneath it now, in fresh pencil, a second line had been added sometime that week, the handwriting careful, deliberate. "Camille, 2026. She said nothing at all. She set her palm flat against the weathered wood, feeling the grain of it beneath her fingers. He set his hand beside it a moment later, close enough that half a hand's width of evening air sat between them, and no closer than that. Not yet. Poppy came running down the row with her arms outstretched, and pressed a small pair of pruning shears into Camille's open hand, freshly cleaned, the blades still faintly smelling of oil. "Dad says you should keep these," she said, out of breath, grinning. "Next season you come back and prune with us." Camille closed her fingers slowly around the handle and looked up at Silas, standing there in the last of the light with his daughter's laughter still hanging in the air between the vine posts. He didn't nod, but he didn't look away either, and in the quiet between them, with the whole valley going dark gold around the 3 of them and the season's last warmth still caught in the old wood at their hands, that was answer enough for both of them, and would go on being answer enough for however many seasons came after this one. Neither of them had said what they meant. They didn't have to. The vines had heard it first,